Right, we have our panelists here just to weigh in on what is happening with the President Nkurunziza right now. This also was the same scenario that we had in Rwanda, where they had also to amend the constitution. Right now that we're given to understand also President Paul Kagame can rule until 2034. The same is happening to Uganda, that we saw also skirmishes in parliament where MPs were really protesting, some of them, the extension or amendment of a constitution for President Yoweri Museveni to extend his term as well. And interestingly enough as well, he was not very sure when he was born, right? So the clergy also, they were really surprised that the dates of the birth of President Yoweri Museveni was diametrically different from what he has in his birth certificate. Let's talk about this, what is happening right now. There is a referendum in Burundi, so to speak, and we know this is happening in the East African countries. People want to extend their term to stay in office, to stay in power. Let's hear from Dr. Hassan Kanenje.
Ibal, Mubarak and Mugabe may be gone, but Mugabeism is not gone from the continent. You know, a lot of our leaders have this syndrome. Some of them come to power when they have good intentions. But the moment they test that power, unfortunately, becomes a little bit too sweet. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the situation differs from country to country. In Burundi today, Nkurunziza is a former rebel leader who then ended up becoming president. And the Burundi situation, there is a huge division between the Hutu and the Tutsi, just the way it was for many years. You know, in Rwanda, that Kagame has tried to de-ethnicize or de-tribalize the language and labeling and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But in Burundi, this thing is real. Now, as a member of the Hutu majority, who comprise about 85%, 84% in Burundi, it's increasingly difficult for another candidate to come from outside unless he's coming from internal the Hutu body politic to actually rise to power and challenge him credibly. Now, in other cases, such as Uganda's we have seen, Museveni, when he came to power, he was a very promising leader too. I think sometimes when you stay in the office for too long, it grows on you and it becomes increasingly challenging to get out of power. Now, these countries also suffer from one common problem. For a long time, the opposition and civil society has been muzzled. They are not strong enough to actually put together a credible challenge to government. They don't have the reach that the government in power has. They don't have the media support behind them in most cases, in part because government tends to control the media. And unfortunately, it is happening in the 21st century. Now, unless collectively, not just those countries as individual countries, but the region and also the world actually exert some external pressure to them that, hey, I think your time is up. Nkurunziza, you can't rule forever. You know, Kagame, I think you've done a great job in restoring Rwanda, but I think it's time to go. Unless you get that type of influence and they exert it, that is deliberate and that is painful, it's unlikely that these guys are actually going to go away. Number one, they have the resources to buy parliament and to buy the public, or at least a section of them.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dr. Mustafa, looking at that editorial cartoon, I think it was 3 weeks ago by Gado, where President Museveni is not really aware about his date of birth in this epoch of time. And yes, now we know what is happening in Uganda as well. Last year I was 73. Now I am 71, he says. I've never been sick all my life. I don't take alcohol, so I'm never drunk. All right? Maybe this is just in light of what we're discussing with what is happening in Burundi right now. They need to do or to have a referendum to change the constitution to extend his rule as well. Should this be an exercise that should be condoned when we know we have the constitution and we should be abiding by the tenets of the constitution?
No, we should not condone this kind of behavior. At least Ugandans, starting with Ugandans, Burundians, they should not condone this kind of behavior where you have presidents just wanting to continue leading their country beyond the constitutional limit. Now, a person like Museveni risks moving in the same direction that Mugabe found himself in.
Yes.
He did a good job. Now he's not doing a good job in Uganda for sure. He did a good job for Uganda. He took the reins of power in Uganda when the country was in tatters after a long civil war, just as Mugabe took, Mugabe took Zimbabwe when economically it was sound, but there was a minority rule there. And I think his handlers should be advising him that it's time for him to go when the country is at its best, so that they can get a kind of a Mandela treatment. But it seems to be let me not call it witchcraft. This is a curse for African leaders. They want to go on and on and on and on. And the reason for this, Dibali, is partly because of the handlers, their own advisors. And secondly, they've committed so many mistakes, some even criminal, so that they are forever watching on their back. The third element here is on youth. Where's the youth in all this? And there is no nurturing leadership in many of these African countries, and there are many people who can lead these countries, and so the youth have to really participate and engage in the political discourse in this country and avoid being bought by these political leaders, because they've acquired or stolen so much resources that they can just buy them off and buy their silence, so that they cannot challenge or criticize this kind of leaders in this part of the world.
All right, so you talk about their advisors, their handlers, their minders. Professor Wajakoya, do you think, first of all, that the advisors and their minders will advise them differently? Because even them, they want to expressly benefit from the rule of, an extension of that particular president. Because we know when we have another regime, I don't have work. Right. So how are you expecting me to advise you differently? In fact, we think maybe the people, the minders of his, are the people who are advising him to extend his rule, or his term, I should say.
I think I've coined the word. I've coined the word on television, on my recent appearances, of the word of mediocres, or brokers, or middlemen. And I've also asked the president in this country.
You've coined it as what?
I've coined these people who run around the president, especially the youth part of them, who run around the president as mediocres and middlemen, who feed the president with a lot of lies, and who want to maintain the status quo, who want to enhance corruption, who do not want other Kenyans whose good views reach the president and tell the president that you are wrong here on his face, so that he can improve the life of our people. And the same thing actually is extended to those who surround presidents. Let me now holistically put that in that approach. Where you find men and women of dishonor who are always around the president, advising the president to do the negative instead of following what ought to be there. Those who appease the president by dancing around him. Those who appease the president by telling him that you are the only one, misadvising, especially and particularly from the intelligence report or intelligence advice to the president. Something is wrong. If you look at Uganda, as my colleague here has said, Museveni came into power when I was in Standard 7. Actually, I'm 58 years today. I've known Museveni to be a good person in the first 10 years. Museveni is my personal friend. I often go to Uganda and I get to meet and talk to some of his officials. But what he has done is wrong. When I was in England, for example, I had a lot of clients from Uganda who had run as a result of persecution. And I had also a lot of clients from Ethiopia, the Oromos. So coming to what you said, dictatorship is not inborn, but dictatorship is by acquisition as a result of greed and corruption. And if you find a president who wants to entrench himself in power by using the mighty grand norm of the armed forces like what Museveni, Kagame are doing, then we ought actually to go back and draw in the drawing room and look at the superpowers. For the sake of Rwanda and Burundi, the people to have a discussion, a meaningful discussion with, are the Belgians and the French. Because where the French have been, where the Belgians have been, we have seen crises, we have seen disasters. So presidents who surround themselves with the mediocres always go away or are always taken away in a very rough environment. And I'm sure that this is going to happen to Museveni, my friend, very soon. It is his own army that is going to rebel against him just like what happened in Zimbabwe.
Thank you. Let's hear from Apollos, then we move on to Ethiopia.
I think when a country gets into power through rebellion, the status quo of democracy does not apply. So they all the time want to continue. They do not have an experience of a changeover of a government. And Burundi and Rwanda are running from Museveni. They are students, very good students of Museveni, that you don't give up power. You continue having it. So it is not like Tanzania or Kenya where the people give up power because we are democracies. So it is just as well that in Tukusa, who is not very old, he's a young person, so he is wondering where he is going instead of continuing to rule Burundi. So it is because of the way he got power. That's why he wants to extend the rule to continue.
All right. I just want also to maybe put up a cartoon before we move on. This is the four arms of government, African style. That was actually, it was actually a collapse there. I'll try and mount it again for you to see it. This is the military style. Just to see the four arms of government, African style. We have the judiciary, we have parliament, the executive, and the military. Maybe the military man can talk to us and tell us. Of course, we know what really happened in Zimbabwe. Very briefly, then we move on. We pray that this may not happen in Burundi, even as they are pushing for this referendum.
You can only behave the way you behave, the way they are behaving, when they are sure the military is with them. And how do you make sure the military is with them? You give them what they want. You give them good salaries. You make them get into business with you. You make them feel indebted to you. And therefore, at the end of the day, they protect whatever they have and what you have. What I'll say about East Africa, I think when you compare East Africa and West Africa things are changing. Because we have very stable democracies in West Africa now, because ECOWAS has been fairly strong in terms of ensuring that most countries in West Africa fall within the ECOWAS statutes and rules of engagement. And we've seen in situations where people become problems and they are told by ECOWAS, you can take a walk. We saw that in Burkina Faso, seen that in Gambia. And you see stable democracies, Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria is now coming back. But in East Africa, we have a leadership that does not reprimand their own. So that if, for example, Magufuli becomes alone and feels that things are not maybe running well, I'm not saying he's doing very well now, we hear he has issues also. But if we had a regional bloc that was also forceful in a way that other leaders in the region tell them not to do this, and the consequences will be this, even if they refuse to accept those consequences at that time, I think we have poor leadership in the East African region in terms of regional blocs and regional economic communities, where all these things have been internalized through statutes and laws and formulations, that you cannot be a member of the East African community if ABCD is not achieved. You cannot be a member of IGAD if you've not achieved this. And all this is about political, economical, and security-wise. So if you cannot enforce what you have, then you allow what we are seeing in East Africa. And that's why Museveni can do what he wants, because East Africa has no enforceable mechanisms, and the leaders who are supposed to be enforcing do not care. We see that in Rwanda. Rwanda could be a special case, but you know, somebody was saying that because of ABCD, then I think it was Apollos. A good leader, you must build institutions. A good leader, you must build good leaders while you're in charge. That's not what we are saying in East Africa. So my take is, yes, you'll use the military, because you're a poor leader. And the military have a monopoly of both foreign relations, internal security, and external security. So when you morph them into one, they become a government in waiting. So what do you do if you are not sure about the rest of your capacity to stay in power? You mollify them by giving them things that will make them happy until it gets to a point like in Zimbabwe where they feel you are now going beyond acceptable norms. Then they'll take over. So that's what we are seeing in East Africa. It's very unfortunate, and we pray that one day we shall have a leadership in this region that we can be sitting down with their colleagues and telling them that what you are doing is not right, because this is why you are in the first place allowed to be a member of the following local bodies.
All right, thank you. And of course, we have also the picture of the current president of Zimbabwe. We hope things will be diametrically different there. That is the crocodile. You can see the army also, they're holding the tail of the crocodile as well. So yes, we hope as well that the constitution will not be amended in Zimbabwe as well, with the current president. But let's move on to Ethiopia right now, and what is happening in Ethiopia. Fresh flare-ups of skirmishes, ethnic divide that is happening in Ethiopia. Briefly, let's just hear from Dr. Mustafa, very briefly.
Yeah, Deepa, Ethiopia is a very fragile country, and you have very serious ethnic animosities in the country, in part because of the way or the kind of conflicts that country has gone through, right from the Derg regime to the time that the Meles Zenawi took over power and the current president. You still find that the supermajority ethnic communities are actually excluded from the mainstream government, and that you have the Tigray, which is a much more smaller community, producing most of the leaders, and that has been problematic. Now, the manner in which Ethiopia has always been dealing with ethnic grievances has been to clamp them down hard, and lots of human rights abuse, and that just only helps in postponing the problem of inclusion again in Ethiopia. Being a very fragile country, I think that's one of the countries to watch in the coming decades. If they do not resolve those problems that they are facing today, then the fallout is going to be catastrophic in that country.
All right, thank you. Maybe Dr. Hananja, you can talk about Liberia and the election. We're going to see a runoff. And of course, we had also here last week the former deputy president of AU, who was also an observer at the Liberia election. So the runoff that will be happening on the 26th, of course, we cannot really speculate, but this is also a good gesture coming from Liberia, where the courts had to decide and to postpone this particular runoff because of irregularities as well. Very briefly, before we move on.
Yeah, about Liberia, in terms of peace and stability, is very young, at least if history of the last 30 years is anything to go by. Seen the brutal murder of Samuel Doe, in the streets. And I think it's trying to go through a process now. Sirleaf Johnson, when she came to power, she promised quite a lot, and the world was very helpful, including the continent. But the truth is, her government was one of the most nepotistic government, in West Africa. A lot of her family members, including her sons, were the ones actually running things in Liberia. Now, there is a divide within Liberia about a number of groups. Of course, you have those who are now allied to George Weah, who I've met in person, during my days in Miami. I used to live there for a long time. He's I don't know about his economic policies, but he seems to have good intentions. Now, and that somehow they have to find a way of negotiating it, because without it, I'm not seeing a very bright future for Liberia without institutional change.
Right. Werunga, briefly, before we move on to Israel.
I wanted to mention Ethiopia.
Yes, please.
Those are our neighbors. I think we need to understand the underlying problems with Ethiopia. The Oromia Liberation Front has been there for some time. Actually, at some point, we were being told they used to use Kenya as their hideout. Now, the problem is this. The Oromo people are 44 million. The population of Ethiopia is 8 million. So one tribe is half the population. Now, what do we need to be discussing, I think, as a country? We've seen two things happen to this country. When Somalia imploded, we got refugees into this country. When South Sudan was fighting, we got refugees in this country. Are we seeing it the way we want to be looking at it? Or we fear that if we start looking at Ethiopia in terms of Somalia and South Sudan, they will think we are demeaning them? Because if anything goes terribly wrong in Ethiopia today, those guys will be running to Kenya, not to Djibouti. Because if they go to Djibouti, they'll cover every step and square of Djibouti, as small as it is. So I think as a country, I'll imagine that our president should be looking at it, is being advised very carefully, that in the event that something goes terribly wrong in Ethiopia, how are we going to take these people? Because this is the only country they will run to. And I hope our planners are looking through this without necessarily demeaning Ethiopia, because the rate at which things are happening now, the killings, the demonstrations, it will get to a point where things might just get out of hand. Are we as a country planning that if in the event that something goes wrong in Ethiopia, and I can assure you if they don't manage it now, things will implode in Ethiopia, are we ready to receive these millions? So to me, that should be the worry of this country. Not even what is exactly happening, although it is inhuman and whatever, but are we as a country looking at the geopolitics and the general impact that will happen to Kenya in the event something goes wrong terribly in Ethiopia? That is what we should be thinking and planning as we discuss with them to see how we can manage the internal. If I were the president of this country, I'll be quietly discussing with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia to see how they can sort out that problem before it spills into this country. And I'll give you an example. Before Somalia imploded, we are told President Moi used to send emissaries to Siad Barre because they saw what was coming. And that's why sometimes people say Moi had his own weaknesses, but in matters of statehood and statesmanship and state leadership, he had a lot of good things about himself, although he ended up misusing them. They saw what might happen in the event Somalia implodes, and that is exactly what happened. So as a country, I think we should be looking at Ethiopia in two ways. What will be the consequences of that implosion inside Ethiopia? What will be the impact of that to Kenya? And then how do we work together with Ethiopia as good neighbors to ensure that we deal with these situations, quiet diplomacy, and also preparing as a country how we can have this and deal with it.
And of course, it's also instructive to note that they've clamped down on social media right now because of inflammatory statements that normally fly around during that particular time. But people will contend that, yes, also this is now infringing on freedom of expression. Very briefly.
Agreed, yes. Agreed, because I know, maybe you wanted to say something.
Yeah, let him say so that we can move actually to other stories. Very briefly on the social media, just a cursory remark.
Yeah, with regard to Ethiopia, right?
Yeah, to social media as well.
Yeah, social media. You know, a lot of people may not have understanding actually of how the Ethiopian government works, but it's essentially a police state. And so we are not surprised when that stuff happens. Now, the current president is Tigray. For a long time, it was Amhara. There used to be an alliance between the Amhara and the Tigray. But with the passing of the late prime minister, what happened is now we had a small group that took power to the exclusion of everybody else. Now that's what formed the alliance between the Amhara and the Oromia. Now this is essentially a police state, and if you go in Addis Ababa, you are actually going to get the feeling if you walk around. So clamping on social media, there isn't even much freedom of the media anyway to start with. Okay, so this won't come actually as a surprise.
But over the years, it's really progressed. You know, even texting in Ethiopia was, I think, 5 years, 10 years ago, was a big issue as well.
Yeah, exactly. But because it's essentially a police state that is so scared of open discussion of what is going on within the country, anything that sounds negative or threatening, chances are they're going to be clamped down.
Right. Let's hear from also Professor Ojokoya, because I know also immigration is really right up your alley. You can actually talk to us, especially are we facing also maybe as Dr. Werunga is saying that a looming crisis in Ethiopia, we should prepare for it. We should have the insight and the foresight to see that what is coming.
Yes, actually, the two colleagues have just said what I wanted to say. But as an immigration lawyer, what I've experienced from the Ethiopians during those years that I've practiced law in the UK and the US, and that's immigration law, is that I've seen a lot of Ethiopians come into exile, especially the Oromios. And let me retract a bit. When I was in the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, some of my classmates were refugees from Ethiopia, the Oromias, who were part of the Oromo Liberation Front. Yeah. And they inspired me by stories that were going on in their country. And when I qualified as a lawyer, I took it upon myself with some of them who are still leaders with the of the Oromo Liberation Front to usher them in to find out exactly what was happening in Ethiopia. And I learned a lot, given the fact that when I was a policeman here, I'm the one who received Hail Mengistu at the airport when he was fleeing. And then we drove him to State House to see Moi. So that kind of limbo, that kind of umbilical cord was there, which actually made me to study a lot on the Ethiopian Liberation Front. But when we come to the immigration, this country,
very briefly,
yeah, this country is not ready at all. Because if you look at the Refugee and Asylum Act, if you look at the way it works in this country, Kenya is still very far away. Kenya is still not prepared to actually implement the refugee policies as per the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, second article in the convention. You find out that refugees who come here are a prerogative of the United Nations here. And that's why Kenya has actually lost it in terms of questioning and interviewing refugees to find out, or to weed out those who are actually a security risk in the country. So if that was to happen there, then we shall become a haven of failed to prepare for guerrilla movement. We shall use Kenya as a playing ground for the Ethiopians to fight back, but I wouldn't want to go into details.
Right. Remember last week we were actually looking at the visit of Benjamin Netanyahu, where he's imploring the African Union to have them actually be constituted as observers within the African Union. And of course, after that, there was the announcement of the President of the United States, that is Donald Trump, that he's recognizing Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, which has actually borne a lot of contention and drawn a lot of flag and protests around the world. And we have a panelist to weigh in on this. This is what we discussed last week. I think we had Dr. Hanenje here alone actually today. So we had, it's actually, you have maybe the memory of what we were discussing, and most of you maybe were following the conversation as well. So what is the future of Jerusalem? And we've heard from the analysts that this is not likely to turn into a military sort of occupation. But we can see in fighting right now. Gaza, the tunnel, there was a bombing, and people are dying so far. Protests are all over. There's a special umbrage that is being raised with this particular incident of now announcing Jerusalem as a capital city. Not bearing the history of it, because I think we laid out. But briefly, can we talk, what is the future of Jerusalem? Let's hear from Dr. Mustafa.
Yeah,
very briefly.
First of all, what Trump has done is to encourage a breaking of international law and a norm that has been there for a very long time. When Palestine was petitioned to create Israel, the state of Israel, Jerusalem, the United Nations in its wisdom decided that Jerusalem was going to be a city that is going to be administered as an international city by the United Nations itself. And so the United States of America, President Trump, has really done a disservice to the international community and the people of Palestine to declare or to urge or to encourage Jerusalem to be the sole capital of the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm. So the president noted that Jerusalem is the seat of modern Israel government, that is Donald Trump. He therefore considers his announcement nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. So there is an argument for this decision, that this is a recognition of reality. Let's hear from
On that
recognition of reality, is it the reality?
Well, yeah, I mean, you cannot, a thief can go and steal land and build on that land and then live on that land, and that becomes reality. So you cannot just come and say that you're recognizing a reality because a thief has stolen land and is building on that land. People have to deal with with that reality of that theft in the first place. And that's what it is for Jerusalem.
Okay, let's say from Professor Apollos Mashira.
Trump recognizing Jerusalem for Israel is bad in the first place, because Palestine always thinks that America does not like it. So the idea of stamping Jerusalem for Israel was a major mistake on behalf of the American president. It is actually showing Palestine that it has been neglected all through. So Jerusalem should be a holy site which is recognizable and admitted by all nations. But when you remove Tel Aviv and take it to Jerusalem, you make a mistake. And that is what the mistake Trump made.
So I think this was a mistake, truly, because Donald Trump says, of course, these other presidents, they've been pussyfooting with this issue. There's never been a decisive action. We know about the Jerusalem Embassy Act as well. Now they want to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So the president says he's taken a stern action, which other presidents they've been, gun shy to do or take. Let's hear from Kanenje very briefly.
Well, that is not surprising for a man who's admitted to believe in alternative facts. And even his party has gone to the extent to actually admitting that. Now, Trump is doing two things. Number one, it's not just encouraging violation of international law, it's actually a violation of international law. Resolution 181 and 478 reaffirmed that. Now, East Jerusalem in particular was actually taken in the Six-Day War in 1967. It's internationally not recognized to be part of Israel. And in the initial resolution of 171, Israel, in the principle called corpus separatum, was supposed to be administered by the United Nations or an agency. It was supposed to be an international city. Now, the way things stand right now in terms of territory and land, you can't have a two-state solution because what remained of Palestine is not contiguous, it's not viable. So that's almost like putting the death nail into the peace process. It's impossible. Now, non-recognition of those facts does not negate their factuality. Ultimately, reason has to prevail, because if there has to be peace between Israel and Palestinians and Arabs, for instance, there has to be a separate state of Palestine, because either Israel remains and elects to become an apartheid state, occupying and subjugating a population, or they become Jewish and democratic. You can't have it both ways.
All right, so we can see also the disapproval of the EU on this. Now they've shunted away from that particular decision by Donald Trump. You're talking of a two-state solution. This also is what has been pushed by the United Nations, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
And the European Union as well. But you say also this is neither here nor there.
No, right now the way things stand, because remember, Israel has been expanding settlements deep into Palestinian territories. What is remaining is actually very small parts that are not contiguous. They're separate. It's like having two little dots within another country. You cannot form a nation like that. And that is why the talks with regard to the final status issues, those people who are familiar with them, they have to create a state that is contiguous, that is actually viable. Today, what remained of Palestine is not viable. So what they're doing pretty much is making it completely clear that this thing won't even happen. So, Netanyahu cannot come and tell us that, oh, you're interested in two-state solution, but then you're increasingly making it difficult, actually, to even have a semblance of a state of Palestine, because right now within the so-called territories that remained, and the political status and even the economic status of Palestine cannot make it a viable state. And so those issues have to be addressed, but I don't think Donald Trump is the one who's going to do it. We're going to have to wait until perhaps the next election, hopefully, get a new president.
All right, let's hear from Ojakoya, because I want us also to peg this as argument arguments for the decision and against the decision, because we have also proponents for it or against it, saying it will, first of all, it will escalate the threat of violence. Also, the timing is very wrong. It is indecisive of President Donald Trump to actually come and make this particular announcement now. And of course, it will also undermine the peace process as well. And what is the way forward? Let's see from, very briefly.
Yes, I'll look at this issue on two prongs. First of all, I'll look at it as a constitutional law expert, and secondly, I'll look at it as a teacher of international law. Now, starting from the constitutional law perspective, the U.S. Constitution, in the articles of incorporation, is very, very clear. Article 1, I'll leave that one out. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, if I'm quoting the right article, it says that where Congress has not legislated or where Congress has not made law, then the president can deal with the matters in foreign affairs as he deemed to, and then inform the Congress for Congress to sit down and validate or invalidate. In this case, any statements made by the U.S. President under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution are temporary statements. They have no power in law. They are rhetoric statements. They are just statements that are there for the president to, and they can lead to impeachment. They can lead to impeachment.
In his speech, the president noted in his remarks that the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which I mentioned, was passed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority in Congress and was reaffirmed by a unanimous Senate 6 months ago.
Yes, Congress passed that act on the transfer of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but it did not recognize Jerusalem as a city. And I'm sure that there's nowhere in that act of Congress which says that Jerusalem is going to be the city of Israel. But when you look at the Jewish lobbyists...
So you were saying this in passing to give the impression that also there was a support from both houses?
Yeah, probably, because as far as I'm concerned, as a lawyer in the U.S., as far as I'm concerned, that has not been passed by Congress. That is not law, and that can lead to impeachment, and that can lead to the Senate calling in Trump to actually ask him as to how he reached that particular decision without congressional approval. And we have seen history within the American presidents. For example, when George Bush Jr. declared war on Iraq, he declared war without congressional approval and also budgetary allocation for that war. But the act also said that where the president declared war, he ought to inform the Congress within 10 days so that the Congress can sit down and appropriate funds to deal with that war. And that is a living example. So where Trump comes in and makes street-side statements as going against the fundamental rights enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, that will not hold any water. Now, going on the second prong, as a teacher of international law, yes, even though international law is not binding, it has no policing mechanism, it's persuasory. If at all it was implemented, and that's what happened at that particular time, then Trump stands to be impeached by the Congress.
Stands to be impeached by the Congress, right. You want to weigh on this as briefly as we're winding up?
I don't know whether I got it wrong. But one, Trump signed an executive order, which is allowed in law.
Yeah, so this is where
that's why I'm disagreeing a bit with Prof. He signed it and he showed us, declaring Jerusalem as an executive order, making Jerusalem as an American government policy capital of Israel. But again, number two, that Jerusalem Act you are talking about, each president has been postponing it every 6 months.
Yes.
Because it was supposed to come into operationalization after a certain period of time. But every time they've been postponing it after 6 months. So what Trump did, and I'm not entirely agreeing with what he did, but as far as I'm concerned, what he did, he stopped with this idea of signing this thing after every 6 months, and he said, you know what, this thing is there. I'm passing it. People can come and challenge it later, but I'll no longer be signing this thing for after every 6 months. Number three, I think, even as he says it is not viable to start Palestinian state, the general understanding and acceptance is that the only solution to that problem is the two-state solution. How it is going to be done, and the agreement is once that is established, Jerusalem becomes the capital of both. So I think because the process has not reached its conclusion, even without the Palestinian state being unviable at the moment, we still want to accept that because the EU is in agreement, most of the countries in the world are in agreement, even Arab states, that the only solution to this problem is a two-state solution. I want to buy my time and imagine that if it succeeds, then Jerusalem will still be a capital for the two. Now, fourth, realism. The whole government of Israel is in Jerusalem. I don't see ourselves seeing Jerusalem pulling all this, the Knesset, the Prime Minister's office, everything to Tel Aviv, just because things are not working unless we go to war and Israel is defeated. So I think I've never agreed with the Trump on many things. But I think we also need to understand that there's a difference between realism, perception, and international geopolitics. So what are the international geopolitics saying about the city of Israel? What is the regional geopolitics thinking about the city of Israel? What is the realistic aspect on the ground that we find in the Arab world, and what does the American law say? So when you put all these things together, I think Trump was just doing what is already there, but the rest of the presidents have been postponing it after every 6 months.
All right, we need to wind up on this. Let's hear from Dr. Mustafa very briefly, and then we'll just give you a one-liner, Professor Wajakoya, very briefly.
Yeah, I think Dibali is very important that the Middle East crisis with regard to Israel and Palestine is brought to closure. And the way to do that is to have a viable Palestinian state that lives next to the Israeli state in peace. And to do that, one has to recognize that Jerusalem is a capital that is for both Israel and the Palestinian state.
Right, thank you.
Yeah,
Professor,
I just wanted to expand on what my colleague has said, and I agree with him. When it comes to issues of executive orders in themselves are not binding. Recently, Trump signed an executive order to exclude certain category of visa, green card holders from going out or coming into the United States. And that was actually invalidated by Congress, but not invalidated by the Supreme Court when somebody filed that. So if he has signed an executive order, that executive order can also be challenged in the Supreme Court. It's not binding. And second, finally, yes, I do agree with what he has said, but what I don't agree with is Israel encroaching into East Jerusalem.
Thank you. Right. Kanenje, very briefly, 30 seconds, winding up.
Yeah. When you find yourself in a deep hole, the first thing is to stop digging. What Trump has done is just to bring in an excavator to actually dig even a deeper hole with regard to resolving this Arab-Israeli conflict.